Sylvia Haltain is my co-chair of the plant sciences session, and she's in charge of the subsessions tomorrow. So this particular subsession has kind of a taxonomic emphasis, and some of the others are more ecological. And we're going to be starting with Dylan Burge, who's at the California Academy of Sciences. Yay, Dylan. And he's going to be talking about patterns of plant diversity and endemism in the California Floristic Province.
All right, thanks everybody. It's a bigger room than I expected. You're supposed to turn that off in a second. So yeah. Okay, sorry about that. We had both mics on there. So I'm going to be opening up the session with a pretty broad talk on pretty much the whole flora. And exciting to me, I've seen a couple of other talks and a few sessions on a similar theme with some of my co-authors on this talk. So I think we're going to be getting a pretty nice update at this conference on our sort of floristic impressions of Western North America. This was a large collaborative project. It came out of a little bit of work I was doing with Susan Harrison, where we were sitting down to write a chapter of a book she was working on, and we realized that despite the fact that we have a really brand new, very highly updated grip on the flora of the state of California, we actually had really no concept of what the sort of levels of endemism were for the California Floristic Province, this biotic region that is sort of that encompasses most of the state of California. And what we thought was going to be about a 3-week project to try and reconcile this into some numbers turned into about a 2.5-year project. So I'm here today to tell you all about what we figured out. So I probably don't need to tell most people here what the California Floristic Province is. It's one of the Earth's 34 biotic hotspots. So these are basically a land area of the planet that support about 50% of all biodiversity on less than 3% of the area. And that's not just 50% of species total. This means that this is 50% of all species. So basically the entire distribution of 50% of life on Earth is in this 3% of area, which is a pretty staggering idea. And it's sort of one of the key concepts of biogeography, the fact that the biodiversity of our planet is highly heterogeneously distributed. It's not distributed evenly in any way at all. And so that's sort of your assumption going into a project like this. It happens that we live in one of the Earth's temperate biotic hotspots, the California Floristic Province here. There's only a handful of other temperate hotspots, a little bit of one here in Chile, off the Cape of South Africa, southwestern Australia. So we're in a pretty special place here, and I think everybody here knows that. So the California Floristic Province is defined both biotically and sort of climatically. It's a region of high diversity and endemism, and it's defined mostly by climate. So this is essentially the Mediterranean-type climate envelope of Western North America, which is driven by our sort of offshore upwelling of cold waters during the summer. Basically stagnates any storms that are coming off the Pacific, and so we get a 9-month dry season here in this floristic region, up to 9-month dry season. So this is unusual. I always like to tell people, even if it's a really expert crowd like this, this is a very odd climate. So on most of the planet, the warm season coincides with the rain season, and most of the world's plants are adapted to that. They grow when there's water. It makes sense. The California Floristic Province is different. Here, the warm season corresponds with the dry season. And so that makes it a very unusual place, and so we end up with unusual flora. If you combine that with the high topographic diversity and extreme diversity of soils that we have here in parts of Western North America, then you sort of set up the perfect scene for a sort of explosion of diversification or an accumulation of species. And of course, because the floristic province is defined climatically and biotically, it doesn't pay any attention to political boundaries. And so we end up with a little bit of Nevada, a little bit of Oregon, a pretty good chunk of Mexico, and a big piece of the state of California. So we went into this with some pretty basic questions. We wanted to know how many native taxa there were in the California Floristic Province, which of course is going to be mostly our California plants, but not all of them. We wanted to know how many of those are endemic to this region. What's the level of endemism? If you pick a plant at random from a site here in the California Floristic Province, what's the probability that it's only going to be found in this region? And also, what are the connections among regions? Just to understand how much of this flora that we sort of think of as the California flora is really shared with places like Baja and Oregon. And most of these questions have been answered to some degree in the past, but what's been missing in the past is an actual list of taxa so that we can go through and reconcile this and keep track of it through history. Raven Axelrod did a really good job in 1978 in a landmark paper that sort of set the baseline for understanding the diversification of plants in the California Floristic Province and its history through geologic time. And they presented numbers for a lot of these answers, but what they didn't actually present was a list. And so when we went to write the flora and to do all of our work through the decades subsequent to the writing of that paper, we really actually haven't had access to the real list. We don't know what that is, and we can't update it. So we don't know how modern taxonomy and phylogenetic understanding has affected these rates of endemism, as well as new discoveries. So we started with a set of 3 key data sources. So it was mostly the Jepson Flora project, the Jepson eFlora at this point. And to that, we added the work of Bart O'Brien et al., the group of collaborators that was listed on the front screen there, key among them being John Redman and Sula van der Plank. And they have come up with a new checklist of native and endemic species of this little bit of Mexico, of Baja California, that is part of the California Floristic Province. And that's coming out very soon. And they were kind enough to share that list with me. And so we went about trying to reconcile the taxonomy of this list of species with this list of species that we have from the Jepson manual. And at the same time, I had a project going on with the Oregon Flora project to reconcile their new understanding of the flora of Oregon with the California taxonomy. For those of you who work in Oregon, you know that they're very proud of their flora, and they're not that concerned when the taxonomy differs from the taxonomy in California. So that was a big project, actually, bigger than the Baja project. So we decided about halfway through this project to actually deal with the mosses as well as the vascular plants. I work with Jim Shivak, who is a moss guru, and he convinced me that we really needed to throw the mosses into this. And probably most people would know or agree that there's not the moss flora of California doesn't really hold a candle to the vascular flora in terms of raw number of species. But these are important organisms, they are land plants, and I think that for a long time the vascular plant elitists have sort of looked down at the mosses and maybe not included them as often as they should in their work. So we included them. We stopped at lichens because I think you'd be hard pressed to make a case that that's a land plant, but I think the mosses are pretty obvious to add in. So this diagram here kind of shows the key reason why this was a research project and not an actual 2-year research project and not just an afternoon sort of lark. As most of you know, the definition of a species is based on its circumscription. So when you think about a species, it's not just the name that's assigned to it. You're thinking about actual living populations of plants in the real world and how those populations fit together in terms of the names. When you say a name, how many of those populations are you talking about and where are they? And so right here we have this great example of 2 different species. So this one would have a name and this one would have a name, corresponding, comprised of 4 populations each. And this one is endemic to the California Floristic Province, and this one is not endemic. It's not even native to the California Floristic Province. However, all it takes is one difference of opinion, and you've made a major change here. You've rendered this species a non-California Floristic Province endemic, but a native of the California Floristic Province. And so we had this problem times about 5,700. So we basically had to go through and try to reconcile every single name that we came up with in our list, make sure we had synonyms in the list, and then make sure that the circumscriptions were correct. And as you know, this often comes down to opinion. So I was on the phone to a lot of different taxonomists trying to get their impressions of stuff and talking about leptosiphons and gilias and all kinds of interesting plants, and it was a really fun task, but a massive task, and that was why it took 2 years. And so we finally got some numbers for this. I'm hoping to submit this very soon. This talk was actually a really good motivator for me to finally finish this project. So here's what we came up with. We got about 5,014 species that are native to the California Floristic Province. So this has excluded all of the introduced plants. And of those 5,014, 1,878 are endemic. It's about 37%. And then as far as the regions go, the California portion of the California Floristic Province is a big chunk of these, almost all of them. So there's not a lot of endemism being contributed by Oregon or Baja. And this is actually significantly less than what Raven and Axelrod found. These are our regional patterns. And you can see sort of the contributions of diversity. So these little black dots are the endemics of a particular region. These are the Jepson regions. So you can see the Baja California, even though it has a pretty small flora here overall, there's a large contribution of endemics when you compare it to a place like Oregon or a lot of the California areas. But the California areas are generally pretty comparable. One of the things that we've thought was really fascinating in terms of the output of this research were these connections here. So you can see 54% of our native flora being shared between this northwestern portion of California and this little tiny piece of Oregon here. So there's a 50% chance of any species in either of those regions being shared across that boundary. It's a pretty strong connection, and one that shouldn't be ignored if we can avoid it. And it's almost a similar level of commonality between Baja and the southwestern portion of California. So these are your biotic connections. This is the biota not stopping at the borders. They just don't care. For the bryophytes, we got a much smaller list. There's almost 800 species native to the California Floristic Province. About 38 of those turned out to be endemic, so a pretty low level of endemism. And most of them were in the California portion, in particular the central western portion, the coast and the center part of California. And no endemics to Baja, although Jim is convinced that they're down there. And one endemic to the Oregon-California Floristic Province. And just by way of comparison, here's our numbers compared to Raven and Axelrod's. So we got a significantly lower percentage than Raven and Axelrod did in terms of their endemism. And I think that this is driven mostly by differences in taxonomy, and probably also potentially driven by maybe a less conservative approach in the Raven and Axelrod piece. I think they were kind of going on instinct. They were just kind of, you imagine they're sitting in their office going through the list, and Dan Axelrod would say a species, and Raven would be like, endemic, and they go to the next species. Not endemic. So I think that this could be potentially some error, but it's also there's a general trend toward more species in California, and there's also a general trend toward more knowledge of the distributions of the species. And so the more you know, probably the less of these are turning out to be endemic. And of course, compared to the state of California, it's quite a bit more, because we have the desert adding a lot of taxa. And so I think that part of what this project sort of reminded me of is the need for not just more floristic types of work, but more digitization so that we can have the data that we need to have a biotically driven understanding of floristic provinces. So instead of predefining the province and then asking how many species are in it, we ask the species distributions what the provinces are and go from there. But that's going to require a lot of data, and it's going to require that data to be very high quality. The names are going to need to be right, the locations are going to need to be right, and we're going to need to have images at least so that we can go through and have some sort of curation of it. And also emphasize to me the need for cross-border studies. The fact that this isn't mapped here doesn't mean it doesn't exist. You can't just ignore it. So those are the answers to the questions, just to remind everybody. So a lot of strong connections, a large number of species, more than we thought in the recent past, but a lower level of endemism than we probably thought a few years ago. With that, I want to thank my collaborators, my statistical guru, Carl, and volunteers at the Academy who did a lot of work on this project, and an illustrator who helped me with some pretty illustrations. Thanks to all of you. I guess I have time for a couple questions. All right, right here.
Did you deal with infra-specific types of variety subspecies?
We did, but because it was a 15-minute talk, I left those 2 slides out. So yeah, those will be in the paper.
Well, how did you deal with it?
We dealt with them by sort of doing a separate list in some ways. So we had a list that was at the level of species, and then a parallel list that was at the level of what we call minimum rank taxa. So yeah, it was problematic, but it's easy to deal with if you start from the top. So we luckily did. Yeah. Any other questions? Maybe one more. Right here.
Hey, Dylan, I'm wondering how much do you think your list would change? For example, let's say you had a taxon, 99% of the occurrences were within what you defined, within your CAFP polygon, but one was outside, rendering it non-endemic. How much do you think your list would change if you were to be a little fuzzy?
That was a great question. The question was whether if we had a fuzzy list where we sort of allowed maybe like one plant that was 100 feet over the California Floristic Province border to still count as some kind of endemic. And I think that would boost the numbers really high. And I think that's where the Raven and Axelrod numbers come from. I think they were kind of maybe fudging it a little bit. They didn't have GIS, they didn't have Google Earth. So I think that with all these resources, we sort of realized that a lot of these plants just get right to the edge and maybe a little over. But I think a statistical approach where you actually score each species in terms of its endemicity, you would get much more interesting numbers, I think. So that would be a future goal, using more distribution data. But the distribution data leaves a lot to be desired right now. So, yeah, thanks again, everybody.